I never planned on costing a luxury resort hundreds of thousands of dollars during the busiest week of their year. Honestly, all I wanted was to get across my own bridge. But when a man making six figures to manage other people's property looked me dead in the eye and basically told me my home was the problem, something inside me shifted. And what happened over the next few weeks ended with lawyers, steel barriers, canceled reservations, and one very expensive lesson about taking someone's land for granted. My name is Caleb Mercer, and for almost 12 years I've lived on the edge of Blackstone Lake, a frozen little corner of northern Montana where winter doesn't ask permission before showing up. My place isn't much to look at. Old cedar cabin, wood stove, a porch that survived more snowstorms than some marriages. The kind of place where the floor creaks when temperatures drop and where every repair somehow becomes a weekend project whether you plan for it or not. And honestly, I loved it. What made the property unique wasn't the cabin, though. It was the bridge. A narrow wooden bridge stretched over a shallow inlet connecting my property to the county road. 1 lane wide. No fancy railings. No decorations. Just enough space to get my truck across and get groceries home before another storm rolled in. That bridge was my lifeline. No bridge, no access. Simple as that. Now, about half a mile uphill sat something completely different. The Silver Ridge Retreat. If my cabin looked like a postcard from 1985, Silver Ridge looked like a magazine cover. Glass cabins overlooking the lake. Heated stone walkways. Private chefs. Luxury snowmobile tour. The kind of place where guests paid more for one weekend than I spent on property taxes all year. For years, we barely interacted. Their guests stayed up the hill. I stayed down by the water. Everybody minded their business. At least that's how it started. Then winter arrived. The first major snowstorm hit during the second week of December. Heavy snow. It's snow. The kind that sticks to everything and turns into concrete overnight. I woke up before sunrise, poured a cup of coffee, pulled on my boots, and stepped outside expecting another normal winter morning. Instead, I stopped dead in my tracks. The entrance to my bridge was gone. Not hidden. Gone. A wall of compacted snow stretched across the entire access point. Waist high in some places. Higher in others. This wasn't natural snowfall. This was plowed snow. Thousands of pounds of it. And, judging from the tire tracks leading uphill, I knew exactly where it came from. Silver Ridge. I stood there for a minute staring at it. You know that feeling when your brain is trying to come up with innocent explanations while your gut already knows the truth? That was me. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe some seasonal worker got careless. Maybe visibility was bad. I wanted to believe that. So I grabbed a shovel. 3 hours later, my hands were numb. My shoulders felt like someone had beaten them with a baseball bat, and I had finally carved a narrow path wide enough to cross safely. 3 hours, just to leave my own property. Still, I let it go, because sometimes people mess up. That's life. A few days later, my neighbor Walt stopped by in his old pickup. Walt was one of those guys who somehow knew everything happening within 20 miles. He took one look at the snow pile and shook his head. That resort's getting bigger every year. I laughed. Maybe they just had a bad day. Walt gave me a look. The kind older men give when they know you're about to learn something the hard way. Maybe. Then he drove off. A week later, the second storm arrived. And this time, there was no misunderstanding. I walked outside before dawn and actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the situation had become ridiculous. The pile was twice as large as before. Snow had been shoved directly against the bridge railing. One of the support boards had cracked under the pressure. I crouched down and ran my hand across the damaged wood. That bridge wasn't just property. It was access, safety, emergency response, everything. And somebody was treating it like a dumping ground. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with an accident anymore. Somewhere along the line, someone had decided my problem didn't matter. And once people start thinking that way, things rarely get better on their own. So I went inside, picked up my phone, and called Silver Ridge. I asked for whoever managed maintenance operations. A few minutes later, a man named Derek Lawson got on the line. His voice was calm, professional, and somehow dismissive before I had even finished introducing myself. I explained the situation. The snow, the bridge, the damage, everything. He listened quietly. Then there was a pause. A short one. The kind that tells you somebody isn't actually considering what you said. Finally, he replied, "Our crews are operating within approved snow removal zones." I looked out my window at the broken bridge. "Your approved snow removal zone is blocking the only access to my property." Another pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Well, maybe your bridge is too close." For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. I pulled the phone away from my ear, stared at it, and slowly brought it back. Too close. My bridge, built years before their expansion, on my property, was somehow the problem. And standing there in my kitchen, staring through the frost-covered window at that cracked railing, I felt something change. Because up until that moment, I had been asking for help. The second he said those words, I stopped asking, and I started paying attention. The very next morning, I made a phone call that would end up changing everything. Now, at the time, I wasn't thinking about lawsuits or easements or any of the things that came later. Honestly, I was just angry enough to stop guessing. If somebody was going to keep treating my property like an extension of theirs, I wanted facts. So I hired a survey crew. Not cheap, not quick, but accurate. 3 days later, they rolled onto the property with tripods, markers, GPS equipment, and enough paperwork to make my head hurt. The weather was miserable. Wind whipping off the frozen lake. Snow blowing sideways. Everybody looked cold and annoyed. But they worked anyway. I spent most of the day standing nearby with a thermos of coffee, watching them move back and forth across the property line. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then around mid-afternoon, one of the surveyors waved me over. "You might want to see this." I walked across the snow and looked where he was pointing. At first, I didn't understand. Then I did. And suddenly a lot of things started making sense. The resort's rear service road wasn't entirely on resort property. Right before reaching the lakeside facilities, it crossed a narrow strip of land. My land. Not much. Maybe 5 feet wide in some areas. 6 in others. But enough. More than enough. A truck could fit through there. A fuel delivery vehicle could fit through there. Maintenance crews could fit through there. And judging from the tire marks frozen into the snow, they had been doing exactly that for a very long time. I remember standing there staring at those boundary markers while one thought kept repeating in my head. They're not just dumping snow on my property. They're depending on my property. That realization hit differently. Because if they needed that strip of land, then the entire situation wasn't about convenience anymore. It was about leverage. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I skipped dinner, dug out old file boxes from a storage closet, and started sorting through years of paperwork. Most of it was junk. Tax records, repair receipts, insurance documents, random notes left behind by the previous owner. Hours passed. The wood stove crackled in the corner while snow hammered against the windows. Around midnight, I was ready to give up. Then I found it. One thin folder, yellowed paper, old signatures, and right there on the first page was a title that immediately caught my attention. Temporary Access Agreement. I sat down. Read it once. Then read it again. Then a third time. About 10 years earlier, after a severe storm had washed out part of the resort's upper access road, the previous owner of my property had agreed to let them use a portion of the land for emergency winter access. Temporary, seasonal, limited, and most importantly, expired. The agreement had a clear ending date. No ambiguity. No automatic renewal. No permanentismo. Nothing. Just temporary permission. I remember leaning back in my chair and smiling for the first time in weeks, because suddenly the entire picture changed. The next morning, I called an attorney named Richard Cole. Rich wasn't flashy. No giant office. No expensive suits. Just a local property lawyer who had spent 20 years dealing with land disputes in northern Montana. I handed him the survey results, then the agreement. He spent about 10 minutes reading everything. Then he looked up. "Well, that was it. Just one word. Well." I laughed. "What does that mean?" He slid the document across the desk. "It means they have a problem. Now here's something most people don't understand about property disputes. Just because somebody uses land for a long time doesn't automatically mean it becomes theirs. There are situations where long-term use can create legal rights. But permission changes everything. If someone was allowed to use land under a temporary agreement, then that use wasn't hostile. It wasn't unauthorized. It was permitted. And once permission ends, the clock resets. That little piece of paper sitting on Rich's desk was worth more than I realized. Because it didn't just protect me. It exposed them. Someone at that resort either knew the agreement existed or should have known. Instead of renewing access properly, they had simply continued using the property year after year. Nobody questioned it. Nobody checked. Nobody bothered. Because that's what happens when shortcuts work long enough. People stop seeing them as shortcuts. They start seeing them as rights. A few days later, we sent a formal notice directly to the ownership group. Not maintenance. Not middle management. Ownership. The letter was simple. The temporary access agreement had expired. The survey confirmed continued use of private property. Effective immediately, any future crossing would be considered trespassing. We also included photographs of the bridge damage. Nothing emotional. Nothing aggressive. Just facts. The response came faster than I expected. Not from the owners. From their attorneys. Of course. The letter was polite. Very polite. Which usually means somebody is nervous. They talked about historic use. Operational necessity. Long-standing reliance. Continuous access. All the fancy phrases lawyers use when they're trying to build an argument without saying they don't actually have one yet. I took the letter to Rich. He read it. Then laughed. Not loudly. Just enough to tell me he wasn't worried. They're fishing. What does that mean? It means they know this document hurts them. A few days later we responded. Short. Direct. Professional. We acknowledged their position. Attached a copy of the original agreement. And made one thing very clear. Future use of the property would not be considered accidental. It would be considered deliberate trespass. That word changed everything. Deliberate. Because once you move from misunderstanding to intentional conduct, liability starts getting expensive. Really expensive. The shift happened almost overnight. A week earlier, I had been dealing with a maintenance manager who barely cared enough to listen. Now my phone started ringing constantly. First Derek, then resort administrators, then legal representatives. Everybody suddenly wanted to talk. The most interesting call came from Derek himself. I was splitting firewood when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. Almost. When I answered, his voice sounded completely different. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the attitude. Now he sounded cautious. Measured. Like somebody walking across thin ice. He launched into a long explanation. Previous management. Incomplete records. Administrative confusion. Communication gaps. The usual corporate language people use when they're trying to apologize without admitting fault. I listened quietly. Didn't interrupt. Didn't argue. Just listened. Eventually he stopped talking. There was a long silence. Then he asked what I wanted. I looked across the frozen lake. Watched snow drifting through the air. And finally answered. The access stops. Silence. And my bridge gets fixed. More silence. Then he cleared his throat. We need time to evaluate operational impacts. That sentence told me more than everything else he had said combined. Because if losing access required evaluating operational impacts, then they were relying on that access far more than they had ever admitted. And deep down, I think Derek knew exactly what was coming. What nobody realized yet was that winter was about to hand me an opportunity neither side could have planned. 3 days later, a massive storm system moved into the region. The biggest snowfall of the season. The kind that shuts down highways, closes schools, and turns every small problem into a major one. And while most people were preparing for the weather, I was preparing for something else. Because for the first time since this whole mess started, I knew exactly where the pressure point was. I was about to find out how much that little strip of land was really worth. The storm arrived exactly as forecast. By sunrise, snow was falling so hard I could barely see the shoreline from my porch. Wind pushed white sheets across the frozen lake, and every few minutes another gust rattled the cabin windows. Most people would have stayed inside. I didn't, because I already had a cruise scheduled. A marine construction company out of Helena. Tough guys. Practical guys. The kind of people who spend their lives working around frozen water and don't scare easily. They showed up just after daylight. I walked them to the survey markers, showed them the property line, pointed exactly where I wanted everything installed. No speeches, no drama, just instructions. By late afternoon, 6 steel posts filled with reinforced concrete stood in a perfect line across the boundary. Permanent, legal, impossible to drive through. I remember stepping back and looking at them. They weren't particularly impressive, just steel and concrete. But sometimes a boundary doesn't need to be beautiful. It just needs to be clear. The first phone call came before sunset. Derek. I let it ring, then ring again, then go to voicemail. The second call came 30 minutes later. Then another. Then another. I didn't answer, because there was nothing left to discuss. The line had been drawn. Literally. What happened next unfolded faster than even I expected. The resort's lakeside operations depended heavily on that access road. Fuel deliveries, maintenance vehículos, supply trucks, emergency equipment. All of it had been using that shortcut for years. Now it was gone, and unfortunately for them, the timing couldn't have been worse. 3 days before New Year's week, the biggest revenue period of their entire year. Every luxury cabin booked, every premium package sold, every lakefront suite occupied. Guests were arriving from all over the country expecting a perfect winter experience. Instead, the resort found itself trying to operate with one arm tied behind its back. At first, the problems were small. Staff members hauling supplies by hand, long delays moving equipment, vehicles forced onto a winding forest road that wasn't designed for heavy winter traffic. Then the bigger problem started. A delivery truck got stuck. Maintenance response times doubled. Guests noticed luggage arriving late. Housekeeping schedules slipped. And once wealthy guests start noticing inconvenience, they tend to notice everything else too. The first cancellation happened 2 days later. Then another. Then another. A friend who worked seasonally at the resort told me the management office looked like a war room. People rushing everywhere. Phones constantly ringing. Meetings stacked on top of meetings. Everybody trying to solve a problem that should have been solved years earlier. Then came a call. Not from Derek. Not from their lawyers. From the owner himself. His name was Grant Holloway. I had never spoken to him before. The moment he started talking, I could hear the difference. No elegance. No corporate language. No pretending. Just urgency. Real urgency. He got straight to the point. What will it take to resolve this? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because a few weeks earlier they had acted like my concerns were an inconvenience. Now suddenly, I had their full attention. His opening offer was $20,000 for permanent access rights. I declined, politely, without hesitation. There was a pause. Then he asked why. The truth was simple. This wasn't about squeezing money out of anyone. But I finally understood something they didn't. Every day that access remained blocked was costing them far more than $20,000. Meanwhile, my situation hadn't changed at all. I could wait. They couldn't. The second offer came the following day. $40,000. Again, I declined. Not because it wasn't good money. Because they were still trying to solve a long-term dependency with a short-term payment. And deep down, I think Grant understood that. By then, the resort was bleeding money. Guests were complaining. Staff were exhausted. Managers were panicking. The problem wasn't disappearing. It was growing. 5 days into New Year's week, Grant called again. This conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. And this time the tone was completely different. Nobody was negotiating around the issue anymore. They were negotiating with reality. The final proposal landed on my attorney's desk the next morning. $110,000. A formal 15-year winter access easement. A complete bridge reconstruction. Not repairs. Reconstruction. Steel supports. Upgraded decking. Professional engineering certification. Snowmelt heating systems at the bridge entrance. Protective barriers preventing future snow dumping. And my favorite part, a penalty clause. Every future violation triggered automatic financial penalties. No arguments. No excuses. No endless debates. Just consequences. I read the agreement 3 times. Then Rich read it. Then I read it again. We made adjustments. Tightened language. Clarified responsibilities. Added enforcement provisions. A week later, I signed. And just like that, the dispute was over. The bridge was rebuilt during the following season. Honestly, it looked better than I ever imagined. Stronger, safer, built to last. The resort regained access. Legally this time. Properly documented. Properly compensated. Everybody moved forward. At least on paper. But here's the thing I've thought about ever since. The money wasn't what stayed with me. Neither was the bridge. What stayed with me was that phone call. The moment Derek told me maybe my bridge was too close. Because that single sentence revealed the entire problem. Not the snow, not the road, not the property dispute. The mindset. Somewhere along the way, people at that resort stopped seeing a neighbor. They stopped seeing a homeowner. They stopped seeing another person entirely. What they saw was an obstacle. And once people start viewing others as obstacles, they begin justifying all kinds of behavior. Shortcuts become normal. Assumptions become policy. Convenience becomes entitlement. And eventually they forget where the boundary actually is. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that I won. Not that they lost. But that boundaries only exist if you're willing to defend them. Because if you don't define your limits, somebody else eventually will. Now here's the question I've gone back and forth on for years. Could I have handled things differently? Probably. Maybe I could have accepted the first offer. Maybe I could have negotiated sooner. Maybe I could have avoided weeks of conflict entirely. Or maybe none of that would have changed anything. Maybe some lessons only get learned when they become expensive. Honestly, I still don't know. And that's where I'd love to hear your opinion. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have kept shoveling snow and hoped things improved? Would you have accepted the first offer? Would you have blocked the road even sooner? Or do you think I pushed things too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I guarantee people are going to disagree on this one. And if you've ever dealt with difficult neighbors, HOA disputes, property line battles, easement conflicts, or someone treating your land like it belonged to them, share your story too. I read every comment. And trust me, some of the real stories people send in are even crazier than this one. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought in courtrooms. They're fought over a few feet of ground that somebody thought nobody was paying attention to.